Welcome to LOA Today. Walt Thiessen and life coach Cindie Chavez here. Today is Tuesday, September the 25th, 2018, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, your first daily dose of happy for the day. And a few of you may have noticed that the live broadcasting feature isn't working on the homepage of our website right now. That's actually a problem that emerged yesterday afternoon during yesterday afternoon's podcast. After the morning podcast yesterday, I updated the antivirus on my computer, and all of a sudden, all heck broke loose. And, the speaker wouldn't work anymore. The broadcast wouldn't work anymore. And we only found that out halfway through doing yesterday afternoon's podcast. But we've identified at least part of what the problem is, and the speaker is working on it. We're hoping to have that resolved very, very shortly. But in the meantime, at least we get to do the podcast recording, which is where most people listen anyway, who are our loyal and wonderful listeners. And so that will continue to go on unabated. But for those of you who are trying to tune in live, now you know why we weren't there with our ever-loving hearts and our joyous voices telling you about how wonderful the day is, right? Cindie, how you doing?
Right. I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, good. That's good to hear.
Yeah, looking forward to happy autumn because we just had the equinox. That's right.
Yes, we did just have the equinox. And
I don't know if that changed anything in your, in your neck of the woods.
I don't think it. Well, I mean, we're getting ready for the fall color. Fall color should be coming this year, although they tell us it's going to come a little bit later than usual. So that's probably the only major change. That plus the cooling of the weather and the cat coming in. Joy is out all summer long, and he finally comes in September because it starts getting too cool at night. So that's the other change. The cat comes in.
Oh, yeah. I forget about. See, I have a tendency to forget about that. That when you live somewhere where it's not high humidity,
right.
When the sun goes down, the temperature drops.
Yes, drops quite significantly.
We have because there's no humidity to hold the heat in the air. We don't have that temperature drop most of the time.
Right.
When we do, it's really great. I grew up with that. It's like it could be 85 degrees and the sun goes down and now it's 58 degrees. It's like grab a sweater, but here it's not like that. So yeah.
I think last night it got down below 50, believe it or not.
What? Oh yeah. My goodness.
And it's going to be in the 70s today, but yeah. I mean, that shows what kind of a range you get in New England. It's crazy, but it's fun.
Well, it is 7 a.m. here, as you know. That's when we start the podcast.
Yep.
And it's 74 degrees right now. but by 11 a.m. it'll be in the mid 80s. And so we don't get too much of a break from it that way, but I'm still, the pumpkin spice everything is in the store, and all these other little signs that might not be weather related. It's like, okay, autumn is here. It really is one of my favorite times of year, and we don't even have the big, change with the colors of the leaves, but it's a nice time of the year. I like it.
Yeah, and. It's not like there are major things that happen because of the change in season. I mean, you know what the biggest change in season for this year is? It's that 3 months ago when we started the summer, we had half the listenership that we have now. I mean, that's the big change right now. I'm looking at the numbers and actually, you know what I started doing? I started getting so excited by the numbers I was seeing per episode in terms of number of listeners playing each episode, that I started doing the Jack Canfield trick. In fact, I even printed it out, and I was getting ready to do that before we did the podcast. I ran out of time, but I'll do it afterward. I'll add a couple zeros at the end just to make the numbers really inflated and vision. We're going to get those numbers coming really soon. Because, I mean, we're growing at a rate like that.
$1.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So. And you know who else did that?
Who?
Jim Carrey.
Oh, no kidding.
I think there's a story about Jim Carrey either adding zeros to a dollar bill or writing himself a really big check, like $1 million check, and putting it on his ceiling or something.
Yeah.
Because it was really funny when my son was a teenager, he did that. And I think he read a story about Jim Carrey doing it. And then I heard you tell the story, or we read the story together about Jack Canfield. And I was like, wait, okay. Lots of people have done this. I wonder who thought of it first. Might have been Jack.
Well, Jack did his in the early 1980s, back when he was working with W. Clement Stone, and before Chicken Soup for the Soul had really taken off.
Right.
So that gives at least a little bit of a time frame. But I don't know who did it first. Who knows? I mean, that
I
idea
love
could have
it.
been around for a while.
Well, it goes perfectly in line to what we're going to talk about today. So,
Really? Neville Goddard took a $1 bill and added zeros to it? No, I'm kidding.
well, Neville Goddard really taught about the power of our imagination.
Oh, yes.
And Neville is one of those people that I just at one time really couldn't deal with reading Neville, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But I really love Neville's writing, and at the same time, it's really funny because it's sort of the same message over and over. But then again, we get that with
Abraham Hicks. Yeah, same thing, right?
But if I had to boil it down to one little fragment, it would be the idea of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. I mean, those are his words.
Right.
And so he's talking about using our imagination to step into that place where we're actually feeling what we would be feeling if that thing we wanted was already ours. And I think about the dollar, the $1 million bill or the $1,000 bill or the $100 bill taped on the ceiling, so that when we wake up in the morning, and not just when we wake up, the other interesting thing that I see a connection with may or may not be, actual, but Neville talks about falling asleep in the place that you want to be and how important that is. And so whether it's a literal place or a metaphorical place, the place of I'm a millionaire or whatever, my body is healthy or I'm happily married or whatever that is, or an actual place, because one of the most famous Neville stories, which may be in this reading, though, was when someone taught him, he wanted to go visit his family who were in Barbados, where he was from, and he was in the States, and they encouraged him to fall asleep at night in Barbados, in his imagination.
This was, if I remember correctly, I mean, I haven't read this in a while, but I think this took place like back in the Depression years. So there wasn't like a lot of money around anyway.
Well, yeah, probably. The earliest, I'm looking at a list of some of his, they're books, but they're very small. They're more like essays. Some of them are a little longer. Some of them are a few pages. Some of them are 100 pages, but I have a compilation of most of them. Was in the 40s, 1941.
Okay.
And this particular one that we're going to read some of this morning was 1954.
Oh, all right.
I think there are also a lot of his lectures available, audio files, and I think he was around until the 70s or 80s. So, but yeah, I'm not sure. I think it will tell that story. I can't really remember, but it's an interesting story. And I love the beginning of this because I don't know. It's one of those things when I read it, I always get, it definitely builds my faith. We talked about Jack Canfield and his top 8 or top 10 things. And one of them was fire up your faith. Right.
That's right.
Right. And it's like Neville Goddard really does that for me. And the interesting thing is when you open Neville Goddard, it's really going to maybe resonate with different people in different ways because he uses a lot of New Testament or Christian scripture. Now, that may really excite some people that love the New Testament.
Sure.
For people of other faiths or who aren't familiar with it, it may not be so much excitement.
This is true.
However, then there's the other layer that the way he defines these verses is so contrary to any way that I was ever taught these verses that may be a real eye-opener and an illuminating factor. It also may rub people the wrong way because they don't think that's what that scripture means and they think it's, not right to be defining it that way. So there's all different ways this can go.
Yeah.
But even if you took out all of those verses out of his writing, I think there's still something there that's very, very important to anyone that's studying the law of attraction. So,
okay.
So we'll just kind of dive in if you're okay with that.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's see what you got.
We'll discuss along the way. So this is from the book, if you want to call it a book. I actually,
if you want to call it a book.
Well, Some of his books are so small. I do have this text all by itself in a book, not in a compilation, but I'm looking at it on the computer screen. It's chapter 1 from Awakened Imagination. It was the very first book that I ever read, written by Neville. And it starts with a 1954, imagination, a quote, imagination, the real and eternal world of which this vegetable universe is but a faint shadow. What is the life of man but art and science? And that's William Blake from the book Jerusalem.
Okay.
Okay. And then there's another quote from Albert Einstein on science. Imagination is more important than knowledge.
Yes.
Which is kind of a heavy duty thing to say if you
think
about it.
Especially for,
a scientist.
A scientist and physicist, right?
Yeah. Okay. So chapter 1, who is your imagination? And here's another quote from Blake. It says, I rest not from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards into worlds of thought, into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. All right. So here's where the paragraph starts. Certain words in the course of long use gather so many strange connotations that they almost cease to mean anything at all. Such a word is imagination. This word is made to serve all manner of ideas, some of them directly opposed to one another. Fancy, thought, hallucination, suspicion. Indeed, so wide is its use and so varied its meanings, the word imagination has no status nor fixed significance. For example, we ask a man to use his imagination, meaning that his present outlook is too restricted and therefore not equal to the task. In the next breath, we tell him that his ideas are pure imagination, thereby implying that his ideas are unsound. We speak of a jealous or suspicious person as a victim of his own imagination, meaning that his thoughts are untrue. A minute later, we pay a man the highest tribute by describing him as a man of imagination. Thus, the word imagination has no definite meaning. Even the dictionary gives us no help. It defines imagination as 1, the picturing power or act of the mind, the constructive or creative principle, 2, a phantasm, 3, an irrational notion or belief, 4, planning, plotting, or scheming as involving mental construction. Now, here's where we're going to start seeing Neville insert his view of the Bible. So buckle up.
Okay.
I identify the central figure of the Gospels with human imagination, the power which makes the forgiveness of sins, the achievement of goals, inevitable. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. John 1:13. Now think about this, what he's saying. He says, I identified the central figure of the Gospels. Now, who is the central figure of the Gospels?
That would have to be Jesus Christ.
Have to be Jesus Christ. He is saying that Jesus Christ is our imagination. So that's a pretty far stretch from what a lot of people grew up hearing, right?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty close to heresy in most people's views who are devout Christians.
Yeah. So that's why I'm saying, like, wherever you stand, whether you can't stand reading the Bible, whether you love the Bible and have a specific, idea of what it means, you may have to just hold on through this. It's okay to just say, I'm not, okay.
And correct me if I'm wrong. I believe somewhere in the same chapter you're reading, I think he actually said something like he considers himself to be a devout Christian who has learned new ways of understanding the teachings of the Bible. I mean, I'm pretty sure he came from that perspective, that he really was devoutly, deeply Christian in his beliefs.
I believe that he believed that he had gotten some enlightenment about what these verses really meant. Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He says, there is only one thing in the world, imagination, and all our deformations of it.
What a word that is. Deformations.
Right. He says, he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Now, that's a verse from the Torah or the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, Isaiah 53:3. He says, imagination is the very gateway of reality. Man, said Blake, is either the ark of God or a phantom of the earth and of the water. Naturally, he is only a natural organ subject to sense. The eternal body of man is the imagination. That is God himself, the divine body. Jesus, we are his members. I know of no greater and truer definition of the imagination than that of Blake. By imagination, we have the power to be anything we desire to be. So he's also quoting Blake and saying that Blake said, the eternal body of man is the imagination. That is God himself.
So Blake was a heretic too.
Yes. So through our imagination, we disarm and transform the violence of the world. Our most intimate as well as our most casual relationships become imaginative as we awaken to the mystery hid from the ages, Colossians 1:26, that Christ in us is our imagination. Now, from my prior life and knowledge, I believe that verse actually says, the mystery hid from the ages, Christ in us, our hope of glory, not our imagination. But you see what he's doing here. He says, we then realize that only as we live by imagination can we truly be said to live at all. And then, which I love, I want this book to be the clearest, simplest, frankest work. I have the power to make it, that I may encourage you to function imaginatively, that you may open your immortal eyes inwards into the worlds of thought, where you behold every desire of your heart as ripe grain, white already to harvest. So he keeps throwing in these little tidbits that are from Bible verses, but he's giving us a very clear message when we look at it. It doesn't sound very clear, which is why I laugh. When
yeah, right.
I want this book to be the simplest, clearest, frankest work. And I'm like, well, I think it was quite confusing the first time I looked at it.
I would agree just by listening to it. It's like, yeah, okay, well, get out of the pulpit and calm down and tell me what you're talking about.
Right? So then he goes on to really get into some things that sounded very confusing to me, because on the one hand, it sounded to me like he was trying to force this metaphor. On the other hand, it started becoming clearer to me what he was seeing in it. And so I'm going to read through it and hope we don't lose everybody to confusion.
Okay.
Because I really want to once he covers this, he gets into some really great stuff that is going to give us some actual instruction on how to use this tool of imagination, no matter what your faith is, no matter what you believe.
And this part is formative to that next part.
It may be for some people. I have a tendency to want to jump right to the stories and the instruction.
Well, I'm okay with that.
Last night I was looking at this. I was like, I really want to highlight it. And I didn't. I don't have my highlighted copy because I gave it away. Okay, but I'll tell you where I want to jump to then. Let's do a little bit of jumping.
Yeah, why not?
So I'm just going to give you a synopsis of what I know of the part where he talks about the forgiveness of sin.
Okay.
He says, and I'm skipping down a bit, but you can find all of these texts are available online. So if you want to read the entire thing, you don't even have to pay for it. You can just do a Google search for Awakened Imagination, and Neville, and have at it. You probably could read the whole thing in an hour. It's not that long. So he has all these scriptures about, Father, reveal thy son in me. And that's not even a scripture. It's a quote from James Montgomery, but he has all of these different verses. It pleased God to reveal his son in me. That's from Galatians, right? So he's talking about you hear a lot of people in New Age circles talk about, the Christ, right? Or Christ in us. And they're talking about something completely different as well. The Christ spirit or the Christ energy, right? He says the supreme test of sonship is the forgiveness of sin. The test that your imagination is Christ Jesus, the Son of God, is your ability to forgive sin. Sin means missing one's mark in life, falling short of one's ideal, failing to achieve one's aim. Forgiveness means identification of man with his ideal or aim in life. This is the work of awakened imagination. the supreme work, for it tests man's ability to enter into and partake of the nature of his opposite. And then he quotes Joel 3:10, let the weak man say, I am strong. Reasonably, this is impossible. Only awakened imagination can enter into and partake of the nature of its opposite. This conception of Christ Jesus as human imagination raises these fundamental questions. Is imagination a power sufficient, not merely to enable me to assume that I am strong, but is it also itself capable of executing the idea? Now, that's funny because when I read that, I think of Jerry Hicks talking about seeing the strong man when he was a kid.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right? And that he wanted muscles like that guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that he used his imagination to actually produce those muscles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's literal, right?
That's right.
Description of this.
Yeah.
He says, suppose that I desire to be in some other place or situation. Could I, by imagining myself into such a state and place, bring about their physical realization? Suppose I could not afford the journey. And suppose my present social and financial status oppose the idea that I want to realize. Would imagination be sufficient of itself to incarnate these desires? Does imagination comprehend reason? By reason, I mean deductions from the observations of the senses. Does it recognize the external world of fact in the practical way of everyday life? Is imagination a complete guide to behavior? Suppose I'm capable of acting with continuous imagination. That is, suppose I am capable of sustaining the feeling of my wish fulfilled. Will my assumption harden into fact? And if it does harden into fact, shall I, on reflection, find that my actions through the period of incubation have been reasonable? Is my imagination a power sufficient, not merely to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, but is it also, of itself, capable of incarnating the idea? After assuming that I am already what I want to be, must I continually guide myself by reasonable ideas and actions in order to bring about the fulfillment of my assumption? Experience has convinced me that an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. That continuous imagination is sufficient for all things, and all my reasonable plans and actions will never make up for my lack of continuous imagination.
Well, finally, after all those questions, we finally got a definitive statement, and it's a good one.
Well, doesn't that sound like all of our work can never take the place of alignment?
Yeah. Well, it's saying the same thing. Exactly.
Or all of our action. Action is the word that I've heard Esther use, right? Abraham Hicks. Mm-hmm. I think that the phrase is pretty close to, there's no amount of action that can make up for lack of alignment.
And interestingly, like you're suggesting there, he's using the word imagination to match up with the word alignment. And truly, that's what happens. When we align, we are using our imaginations to allow ourselves to get into a better feeling place. That's right. Well, that's what we do. Right.
So, is it not true? Now, here's where he goes. Is it not true that the teachings of the Gospels can only be received in terms of faith, and that the Son of God is constantly looking for signs of faith in people, that is, faith in their own imagination? Is not the promise, believe that ye receive and you shall receive, the same as imagine that you are and you shall be? Was it not an imaginary state in which Moses endured as seeing him who was invisible? Was it not by the power of his own imagination that he endured? Truth depends upon the intensity of the imagination, not upon external facts.
Yeah, that sentence right there should be underlined.
Facts are the fruit bearing witness of the use or misuse of the imagination. Man becomes what he imagines. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He has a self-determined history. Imagination is the way, the truth, the life revealed. We cannot get a hold of truth with the logical mind. Where the natural man of sense sees a bud, imagination sees a rose full-blown. Truth cannot be encompassed by facts. As we awaken to the imaginative life, we discover that to imagine a thing is to make it so, that a true judgment need not conform to the external reality to which it relates. The imaginative man does not deny the reality of the sensuous outer world of becoming, but he knows that it is the inner world of continuous imagination that is the force by which the sensuous outer world of becoming is brought to pass. He sees the outer world and all its happenings as projections of the inner world of imagination. To him, everything is a manifestation of the mental activity which goes on in man's imagination, without the sensuous, reasonable man being aware of it. But he realizes that every man must become conscious of this inner activity and see the relationship between the inner causal world of imagination and the sensuous outer world of effects. It's a marvelous thing to find that you can imagine yourself into a state of your fulfilled desire and escape from the jails which ignorance built. The real man is a magnificent imagination. It is this self that must be awakened.
It is this self that must be awakened. The real man is a magnificent imagination. And the only thing I think that's missing from that is his own. So the real man is his own magnificent imagination. He is his own imagination is the way I would phrase it. Because what he imagines is what he is.
Exactly. And so, let's see, I'm going to try to get to the next chapter. Okay. And this is the story. So this is wonderful. This is chapter 2.
Okay.
And it's called Sealed Instructions. There's a quote, "The first power that meets us at the threshold of the soul's domain is the power of imagination." Dr. Franz Hartmann.
Okay.
"I was first made conscious of the power, nature, and redemptive function of imagination through the teachings of my friend Abdullah. And through subsequent experiences, I learned that Jesus was a symbol of the coming of imagination to man, that the test of his birth in man was the individual's ability to forgive sin. That is, his ability to identify himself or another with his aim in life."
I got to interrupt for a second here because there's a significant thing here that I think really needs to be brought out. The name of his friend is Abdullah. That's an Arabic name.
Right.
Abdullah is an Arab. And I just can't help but notice how he made, I mean, I'm not doubting that that was his friend's actual name, but he made the focus of this story, the source of his story, someone who would normally not be considered to be an appropriate voice of a Christian message.
True.
An Arab. That just starkly stands out to me. His friend's name was Abdullah.
We can see that Neville was very open-minded.
Oh, he was, yes.
Right?
And good for him.
I mean, and it is true that in the original language, like the verse in the Christian New Testament that says that all men have sinned, that word sinned actually does mean, it means like shooting an arrow at a target and missing your mark. It just means miss the mark. And remember that, and I won't go too deep here, but remember that all of the ideas that were being discussed in those New Testament writings, they were discussing the Jewish writings. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a saying that if you have two Jews, you have three opinions, right? Because the rabbis are known for, I mean, they're legal scholars. That's what they do. They turn it over and turn it over and turn it over and dig into it. And there's many, many different opinions like any legal scholars. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of missing the mark, you know, it wasn't that idea that sometimes gets presented of, it's just too bad for you. You're done for now. You missed it. Like you sinned and you can never make it. No, it was just that you had an aim and you missed it. And what do you do when you miss the mark? You just get up and try again, right?
I want to bring something to the attention of our listeners, something they may not know, something I just learned within the last week talking to you, Cindie, about how much you have actually studied the religions of the world. In fact, you were so determined to do that, you learned Hebrew so you could study the Talmud in the original. And I'm thinking, whoa! I mean, that just blew my mind when you told me that. But like just now, you were talking about the definition of sin. I just looked it up on Wikipedia. It's exactly what it says in Wikipedia, too. Missing the mark. That's exactly right. So I say that basically to give credential to you. You know what you're talking about. You've studied this stuff in depth, in detail, in university or whatever the setting was that you did it. And I mean, I bow my hat to you. Like, you know, I take my hat off to you and doff my hat because you know this stuff really well. Well,
you know, I always think about when people finish and we go to their ceremony from education and it's commencement, right? Mm-hmm. Which actually means the beginning.
Right.
And I always told my Hebrew students that it's this is just the beginning, right? It's like, and I feel that way. I'm a beginner, so I don't count myself an expert of any of this. There's always more. I've just scratched the surface. There's always more to learn. But I will say this. When he talks about forgiveness of sin, what's really interesting, and we'll get to this if we keep this course and stay with Neville a while, is he actually at some point teaches us how to, and it falls into his forgiveness. I'm making air quotes, his forgiveness of sin category. Mm-hmm. And that is to go back and redo things that happened that day. Like one of the things you're going to learn from Neville that he really says is important that we do is at the end of every day while we're relaxing into sleep, that we take a moment to review our day, and we review it in a way that those conversations that were stressful or painful, we recount them in the way that they would have been wonderful. That we remember them in a different way. He's calling this, we're forgiving that sin. That thing that missed the mark, that conversation that I had with somebody that was stressful and that they said something I didn't like. Maybe I said something I'm not proud of. When I review it in the day, I think to myself, I'm going to imagine it. Here we go with imagination. I'm going to imagine that it unfolded in a very different way and that I didn't say that thing I wish I wouldn't have said and that person didn't give me the response that felt so awful. I'm going to go through that conversation. I'm just going to relive it in a better way. This is one of his tools that I think is pretty fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And because when we do that, often what we see next on our next meeting with that person, it will go better, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I was first made conscious of the power, nature, and redemptive function of imagination through the teachings of my friend Abdullah, and through subsequent experiences. I learned that Jesus was a symbol of the coming of imagination to man, that the test of his birth in man was the individual's ability to forgive sin, that is his ability to identify himself or another with his aim in life. Without the identification of man with his aim, the forgiveness of sin is an impossibility, and only the Son of God can forgive sin. Therefore, man's ability to identify himself with his aim, though reason and his senses deny it, is proof of the birth of Christ in him. To passively surrender to appearances and bow before the evidence of facts is to confess that Christ is not yet born in you. So if we realize that he keeps referring to Christ as our imagination, that sentence would sound a lot different. We could take all the religiosity out of it. Right?
Can we translate it? Can we do a quick
right.
translation?
It would just say that to passively surrender to appearances and bow before evidence of the facts is to confess that our imagination is not fully born in us.
Ah, okay. Now that becomes more clear when we say it that way.
Right? Although this teaching shocked and repelled me at first, for I was convinced and earnest Christian, and did not then know that Christianity could not be inherited by the mere accident of birth, but must be consciously adopted as a way of life. It stole later on through visions, mystical revelations, and practical experiences into my understanding, and found its interpretation in a deeper mood. But I must confess that it is a trying time when those things are shaken, which one has always taken for granted. That's Neville speaking there. So at some point, and he really was, some of his later writings, he got very mystical. And he talked about dreams and visions that he had that to me were like, oh, okay, almost confusing. And so he, at his point, who considered himself an earnest Christian, all of a sudden felt like all of those things he believed so solidly were really shaken, because he was understanding them in a new way. I don't know how. Mm-hmm. Right? So I'm going to skip down to where he starts to tell the story of him meeting Abdullah, because I really think that is useful. Okay. He talks about outer reforms are useless if the inner state is not changed. Okay. And I think that is kind of in a nutshell what the law of attraction is talking about. Yeah. We have to change who we are, right? I talk about this a lot. You've heard me talk about this a lot. I think this is one of the most important things for me to have found, and that is that identity. Everything we experience is always connected to identity. I mean, that's why the mirror work is so powerful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because ultimately we're using the mirror work and other modalities like that as a way to directly address whatever our situation is by feeling good about ourselves. And by doing so through the use of our imaginations, through the use of our thought processes. That's the way I'm seeing what he's saying there. I wish he said it more plainly, but that's what I sense that he's saying.
Well, this is why I like the stories, because they feel a little plainer to me in examples. So he says success is gained not by imitating the outer actions of the successful, but by right inner actions and inner talking. If we detach ourselves from a state, and we may at any moment, the conditions and circumstances to which that union gave being vanish. It was in the fall of 1933. Okay, there's your answer about when this happened. 1933. It was in the fall of 1933 in New York City that I approached Abdullah with a problem. He asked me one simple question. What do you want? I told him that I would like to spend the winter in Barbados, but that I was broke. I literally did not have a nickel. If you will imagine yourself to be in Barbados, he said, thinking and viewing the world from that state of consciousness, instead of thinking of Barbados, you will spend the winter there. You must not concern yourself with the ways and means of getting there, for the state of consciousness of already being in Barbados, if occupied by your imagination, will devise the means best suited to realize itself. Man lives by committing himself to invisible states, by fusing his imagination with what he knows to be other than himself. And in this union, he experiences the results of that fusion. No one can lose what he has, save by detachment from the state where the things experienced have their natural life.
So when he's using the word state, it sounds to me like he's using it equivalent to, say, the word vision, or something that you imagine.
Okay. Well, yes, the state that we're in, it's connected to our identity, and it's also connected to our consciousness. Mm-hmm. The state. We change our state. Just sitting up straight in a chair, we change our state. I'll tell you a quick side story of someone that said to me when I asked them this question, what do you want? And they said, this is the phrase they said, I want to be a well-funded retiree.
A well-funded retiree. Okay.
I said, okay. So I said, so as you go about your day today, as you're doing things, ask yourself this question. How does a well-funded retiree throw the towels into the dryer? How does a well-funded retiree drink her coffee? If you'll ask yourself this question, right? Whatever you're doing at the time, if you're walking from one room into another and you say, and you, let's say you want to be wealthy. Well, how does the wealthy version of me walk from this room to the other? Your state will change. No one else may be able to perceive it, but there's a state that's different. There's something that's different. And we see that with people that are confident. When you look at someone and they're slouching and and then you look at someone and they're sitting up straight, there's a very, they're in two different states.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I see what you mean. Yeah.
And so I think that that's what we're talking about. Man lives by committing himself to invisible states, by fusing his imagination with what he knows to be other than himself. And in this union, he experiences the results of that fusion. So this is identity work. This is becoming that thing that we want to be, that we are not yet, but we're becoming it like from the inside, from the state.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So he says,
I need to talk about just for one more moment, because I'm realizing where it is that I'm struggling a little bit. Because for me, state is like a snapshot, and it's like a photo, a still photo that doesn't move. And what he's talking about is something more fluid than that. Something that that adapts to whatever the situation is, based on a mindset rather than on a snapshot in time. Because a mindset can adapt itself to what's going on.
How often we use the term state to mean something that's emotional. Mm-hmm. Oh, what a state he was in.
Yeah, that's true.
Or we may ask someone, right? I think maybe there's a connection between the words. State is status, right? Mm-hmm. What kind of a state were they in? Mm-hmm. Oh, they were completely, they were fine, or they seemed calm, or they were a total mess, right? Whatever. So our imagination, because think about this, if it's just imagination, certainly it's not going to change the outer world immediately. I mean, if right now I imagine that I'm actually there in Connecticut in the recording studio with you instead of in my own studio.
Mm-hmm.
And we're there. I mean, nothing in this room is going to immediately change. But what has changed? My state. It's the only thing I really can change using my imagination.
Mm-hmm.
But that once we change it there, it starts to outpicture itself in our experience. And he calls that, he says, you'll hear it. I might have already read it one time about hardening into fact.
Mm-hmm.
So here is what Abdullah said to him. You must imagine yourself right into the state of your fulfilled desire and fall asleep viewing the world from Barbados. The world which we describe from observation must be as we describe it relative to ourselves. Our imagination connects us with the state desired. But we must use imagination masterfully, not as an onlooker thinking of the end, but as a partaker thinking from the end. We must actually be there in imagination.
Yeah, that last bit right there. Let me go back to it. Not as an onlooker thinking of the end, but as a partaker thinking from the end.
Right.
That's addressing what I was trying to get at.
Okay, let me give you an example because I'm doing this right now with something.
Okay.
I started last night. As you know, I was very excited because I am an author of a book.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Okay. Well, all of the authors, were sent a copy and it's coming from Denmark.
Wow.
And mine hasn't gotten here yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I see other people posting in our group where the authors are saying, yay, my book got here, right? And it's like some of them are in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
I think a couple of them are in the States. And maybe they're closer to New York where things maybe get quicker because it all comes to one place and then it kind of gets sent out. But my book is not here yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about this last night and I thought, oh, instead of fretting over when is my book going to get here? And I wonder is there a tracking number and blah, blah, blah. Oh, why am I not just doing this? There's always, the cartoon, Charlie Brown?
Yeah.
The one little guy that walks around and he's got like a cloud of dirt around him.
Pigpen.
Yeah. Well, I am the pigpen of books. I walk around with a cloud of books around me. There are books everywhere. I don't like to think that I'm a real clutterer, but there are books everywhere. I would love to just live in a library. And so there are always a little stack of books at least right next to my bed. So last night as I was falling asleep, I just imagined that book on top. I just imagined that book on top of the stack.
Yeah.
And I imagined what that felt like. Oh, so glad it finally got here.
Mm-hmm.
My book is here.
Hooray.
And so I changed my state. My state, now I was the person that had the book already. I was the person that the book had already arrived. The book was here.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of the person worried about where her book was out there.
Very different person.
Yeah, very different, but very subtle shift in my state.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see. I'm hoping that tomorrow when we talk, I can tell you the book actually hardened into fact in my in my house.
Well, we know it will eventually. We know that for sure. It's just a question of the time, really.
Right.
And the time is to a large extent influenceable by you, by just how much you're willing to let go of whatever the resistances are that you've got built up. And you start that process by doing exactly what you described, by visualizing the book already being on top of the stack.
So you see that I wasn't imagining myself going to the mailbox and finding the book. I wasn't looking at the end from where I am now. I wasn't visualizing, the book coming to me. Mm-hmm. I was imagining from the end. I was already the person that had received the book.
Why is that an important distinction? I mean, I sense that it's an important distinction, but why do you see that as important?
Well, I see it as important because it's always a matter of identity. And so I don't want to be the person that's waiting for the book. I don't want to be the person that's imagining the book coming to her. I want to be the person that has the book already.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in envisioning it as the book is already there, it's already traveled in your imagination. It's already done all its traveling, and now you've got it. There's no more waiting for it. There's no more wondering when it's going to show up or anything. You've already got it. That's the state that you're trying to get at. That's the feeling place that you're trying to get at.
Right. And so that's what we're talking about here, where Abdullah said to him, this is not mere fancy, but a truth you can prove by experience. So his appeal to enter into the wish fulfilled was the secret of thinking from the end. Every state is already there as a mere possibility as long as you think of it, but it is overpoweringly real when you think from it.
Yeah, that's a difference right there. It's a subtle difference, but it's a difference. Thinking of it versus thinking from it.
So he says, I began right then and there, fixing my thoughts beyond the limits of sense, beyond that aspect to which my present state gave being, towards the feeling of already being in Barbados and viewing the world from that standpoint. He emphasized the importance of the state from which man views the world as he falls asleep, which to say that is why I imagined, because I do these exercises, and I was actually already in the process of thinking about my day, and I remembered the book. Mm-hmm. And that's when I decided, oh, okay, the book's right down here where all my other books are. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I used that in the process right then. I began right then and there, fixing my thoughts beyond the limits of sense, beyond that aspect to which my present state gave being, toward the feeling of already being in Barbados and viewing the world from that standpoint. He emphasized the importance of the state from which man views the world as he falls asleep. All prophets claim that the voice of God is chiefly heard by man in dreams. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falleth upon men, in slumbering upon the bed, then he opened the ears of men and sealeth their instruction. Now see, I don't need that to be in there, but that's okay. That night, and for several nights after, I fell asleep in the assumption that I was in my father's house in Barbados. Within a month, I received a letter from my brother saying that he had a strong desire to have the family together at Christmas and asking me to use the enclosed steamship ticket for Barbados. I sailed 2 days after I received my brother's letter and spent a wonderful winter in Barbados.
That's a fantastic story. I want to add in a point that I was trying to make about the year. The year was 1933. This was like the depths of the Depression. Money was almost impossible to come by. So not only did he manifest this trip to the Barbados island, but he did so at a time when money was really, really scarce. That's a really significant manifestation. And
also remember, this was before all the technology we have now. He wasn't on Facebook saying, I sure would like to spend the winter in Barbados.
Yeah, there was no hotel.com, no.
He was not, getting a text message, hey, bro, I really would like to come to Barbados. No, there was nothing he did on his part aside from changing his state and falling asleep in his imagination as if he were already in Barbados. And then he gets the letter from his brother. There was no indication that there was any kind of previous conversation going on.
No,
right?
It's like nothing had been a situation where he had written to the family saying, gee, I would really love to come to Barbados, but I don't have any money. And then the Barbados family wrote back, well, geez, we'd love to have you here. We're enclosing a steamship ticket. No, that's not what happened at all.
Right.
It just appeared out of nowhere.
He said, this experience has convinced me that man can be anything he pleases if he will make the conception habitual and think from the end. It's also shown me that I can no longer excuse myself by placing the blame on the world of external things, that my good and my evil have no dependency except from myself, that it depends on the state from which I view the world, how things present themselves.
Another little nugget he put in there, that my good and my evil have no dependency except from myself. Put in more modern phrase, any good or any evil is the label I've put on it.
Yeah.
That's what it's saying. It's saying it in kind of, old world Christian talkies, but that's what it's saying. I'm the one who did it. I'm the one who said that that's good and that's evil.
Yeah. Yeah. He says, the imaginative image is the only thing to seek. Further down, he says, by sleeping in my father's house in my imagination as though I slept there in the flesh, I fused my imagination with that state and was compelled to experience that state in the flesh also. So vivid was this state to me, I could have been seen in my father's house had any sensitive entered the room where in imagination I was sleeping.
Whoa. That's a vivid imagination right there. That's extremely vivid.
A man can be seen where in imagination he is, for a man must be where his imagination is, for his imagination is himself. This I know from experience, for I have been seen by a few to whom I desired to be seen when physically I was hundreds of miles away.
Okay, now he's really flipping me out.
I, by the intensity of my imagination and feeling, imagining and feeling myself to be in Barbados instead of merely thinking of Barbados, had spanned the vast Atlantic to influence my brother into desiring my presence to complete the family circle at Christmas. Thinking from the end, from the feeling of my wish fulfilled, was the source of everything that happened as outer cause, such as my brother's impulse to send me a steamship ticket, and it was also the cause of everything that appeared as results.
It reminds me of a novel that I read by a very, very obscure author that 99% of the population have never even heard of. His name's L. Neil Smith. And he wrote this series of stories that were kind of science fiction-ish in their details. But it was really a very unusual kind of science fiction. But anyway, without getting into all the stuff about L. Neil Smith, he had this one character who appeared in the main first novel. And the character made it into this imagined universe from another universe, very similar to our own here, by simply projecting himself there. By imagining, he didn't want to be in the universe he was in. He didn't like it. There were so many aspects of it that he didn't have anything to do with. He wanted to be in a better place. So he deliberately focused with all of his intensity and imagination on being in another place. And somehow he transported himself to this other universe. I mean, that's basically what Neville is saying here. Neville is basically saying he, in effect, transported himself so that other people could see him, even though he was physically 100 miles away. And the only real difference between the two is that the fictional character managed to get the physical body there as well.
Right. So, I mean, I think it's really powerful and worth considering, this idea. And I've used this idea myself. I can't tell you that I have gone to Barbados because I haven't imagined that, but definitely have had successes using this kind of method. I think it's an important contribution to the body of law of attraction studies.
I think so too, yeah. And I by the way, I have been to Barbados. Louise and I went there for our honeymoon.
Excellent.
Now, we didn't manifest steamship tickets. I mean, first of all, we didn't go by steamship. We flew because we did it the modern way, right? But I do remember what it was like imagining what it was going to be like in Barbados and realizing that I didn't have a clue. I mean, I could look at pictures online and I could, try to kind of imagine it because you can see the pictures. They look really pretty. It looks, very tropical and so forth. But on the other hand, when you're actually there, it feels different. The feel is different from what you see in the photo. And I don't know how to describe that other than to say you feel the weather, you feel the sun. You experience, I mean, I remember one of the first things that we did, because we had a hotel room right on the beach, is we put our stuff in the hotel room and just walked out on the beach just to be there. And we were there at 12 noon. And anyone who's been in the tropics knows that at 12 noon you have no shadow. You can look down at your feet and there's no shadow at all, which is really cool. So
right.
We're out on the beach. I'm looking down. I said, Louise, look, we have no shadow. And I was getting excited about that. And then while I'm standing there, I'm feeling there's a certain degree of humidity, probably similar to what you experience on a regular basis there in Louisiana. But there's a little bit of humidity associated with being in the tropics, and you've got the sound of the ocean, and the sun is coming directly down on you. It's a very different feel from, say, being up here in the Northeast, where the sun is always at a deep, rather steep angle. So that affects the feel of it. There's the smell of the ocean. There's the fact that we were on the Caribbean side, which is the milder side, so you get the mild trade winds rather than the driving trade winds. I mean, the whole thing has a definite feel to it that the photo never shows you. And I say all that as a setup to point out that he had been in Barbados before. I mean, that's where he had, I think that's where he grew up. I'm not 100% sure. But he had been there before. He knew that feeling. Yes. And I can just imagine him in his imagining going back to that feeling. He says so, imagining and feeling myself to be in Barbados, instead of merely thinking of Barbados. The feeling part is really critical and cannot be underestimated. That feeling part is just a huge part of the overall experience you're trying to create for yourself in your imagination.
Yes. As a matter of fact, when I use this, I make sure to address each of my senses. Like, he talked about somewhere, I don't know if we read it today, but that he would fall asleep in the bedroom that was familiar to him in his father's house. Right. And so, it's assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. I mean, the feeling is very important.
It's almost impossible without the feeling. I don't think he could have had that strong, overwhelmingly powerful, imaginative experience without having known that feeling.
Well, he has another book, The Feeling is the Secret. I mean, this is his teaching in a nutshell. So yeah, you're right. And that's a good thing to point out, that he actually had a familiarity with the place.
That makes a huge difference, and it's great.
Even so, we can imagine.
We can. Well, that's the other challenge, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
if we're trying to track something that we have not experienced before, yeah, we're kind of at a disadvantage because we don't know what that feeling is. But on the other hand, we can invent it. Even if we've never experienced it before, we can invent how it's going to feel.
Right.
And that's where what you were talking about really becomes very valuable, because if you kind of take inventory of the five senses and then imagine, okay, well, all right, I have never, let's see, what is it I've never done? Well, I've never been a millionaire before, okay? And I don't know what that feels like because I've never been a millionaire before, but I can start with sight and describe what do I see as a millionaire.
Mm-hmm.
And I can imagine that. And then I can go to sound. What do I hear as a millionaire? And then what do I taste as a millionaire? What do I touch as a millionaire? I can go through all five senses.
Yes.
And in doing that, I can invent a feeling.
Yes.
So.
And that's my answer to anyone that says, well, how am I supposed to feel what it feels like to be, a millionaire or whatever? I've never done that. It's use your imagination.
And the senses are a good way to do that. That's what I like about what you said. You can take inventory of the five senses one at a time and build up that feeling. And that to me is like the best part of his message. I mean, he almost understates it, which is really weird. I mean, he's got all this scripture going on and all this other stuff, but the feeling part is the part that it's almost like, he threw that part under the bus. Like, yeah, feeling, but don't pay more attention to that. And I'm glad he wrote the other book too, but the feeling part is the big part.
This is one of his later books as well, and so he may have covered that in a different book because
maybe that's what it was. Yeah,
a lot, and we may get to it if we continue here too. So,
but boy, is that important, and it's a skill as we're talking about. It's a skill I'm realizing I want to develop more in myself. I want to take the time. For the various things that I want to attract into my life, I want to take the time to not only visualize the end result, not how we're going to get there, but the end result. But I also want to do it using the five senses and taking the time. And sometimes it's a little bit tricky. I mean, I want 10,000 listeners per episode for our podcast. What does that taste like? I'm not sure. That's going to take a little imagining to figure out what that tastes like. It'll probably taste like something. All I have to do is pick something, really. But right now, I'm not sure what that tastes like.
When I do this exercise, I think about, okay, if I want to picture this from the end, right? So what would I be picturing? Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I would be sitting here at the computer and I would be looking at wherever I look that tells me that we have 10,000 listeners. Mm-hmm. And, I'm sitting here right now with a cup of tea. It's pumpkin spice tea.
Ooh.
So I feel the cup in my hand and I can hear you laughing and being excited that there's 10,000 listeners. And I can smell the smell of this tea. It smells really good, and taste it. And did I cover them all? There might be one more. and I can see the numbers on the screen. Mm-hmm. So I've just tapped into all of my senses.
And you create a scene that draws very heavily from what's going on right now.
Right, because it won't be so much different. There will be things that are still the same.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about what Wendy Dillard has been telling me whenever we talk about some of the changes that she's been going through lately, because some of them have been pretty momentous. And I ask her, what does it feel like? She says, it feels normal. It just feels normal. Right. So that means we can draw upon what's going on currently and use that as the basis or as the material for spinning our imagined feeling new place.
Right. I have a pen that I love. Well, I collect fountain pens, but so I can imagine myself, I can feel that pen in my hand and I can hear it scratching across the check as I write the big donation check to my favorite charity, right?
Yep.
I'm looking at it. I'm holding the pen. So it's like you can find a way to do it.
Well, I'm going to have to do a little editing because we're actually a few minutes over on this podcast. But this has been great. And I think we should carry on a little bit more with Neville tomorrow if you're open to that.
I would love to.
All right. Well, let's do that. We hope that you'll join us next time as well here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.